This is not a technical talk. The subject I'm talking about is not technical, it's social, ethical, and political. The issue is, what should the rules of society be for using software? Most of the time when people raise this question, they work for software companies. So they raise it in a self-serving way. They ask, what rules can we impose on everyone else to make them pay us a lot of money? I'm sure you're familiar with the answer they get. I had the good fortune in the 70s to be part of a community of programmers who shared software. And because of that experience, I was able to look at this question from a different direction, to ask, what rules make for a good society that's good for everyone to live in? So I reached a completely different answer, and that answer is the basis of the free software movement. But I should start by saying a little bit about this community. It included programmers at some of the best universities, and even programmers in computer companies sometimes participated. And sharing our software was our way of life. If anyone ever refused to share, it was weird and strange, but it hardly ever happened. The lab where I worked was, in a way, the deepest central part of this community, because in that lab, all the software we used was the community's software. Because the programmers in our lab, the artificial intelligence lab at MIT, programmers who called themselves hackers, had developed a time-sharing system themselves, and I joined that team when I began working there. To be a hacker meant to enjoy the spirit of playful cleverness. So when these people were doing their job, developing the time-sharing system, they were also having fun employing their intelligence cleverly. So that enjoyment is what they meant when they said that they were hackers, when we said that we were hackers. So in this community, we were completely living in freedom. All the software that we used, we had the source code for. We could study it, we could change it. If you asked for a copy, we were delighted that you were interested. Of course, we were glad to give you a copy. In this community, if you walked past another hacker's screen and saw something strange, different, you'd say, hey, what's that? And he'd say, oh, that's the new FooBar program that we just got from Stanford, and it's in the FooBar directory. So at that point, you could go to the FooBar directory and you'd see the executable that you could run, and also the source code, which you could read and study to learn how they solved those problems. If you used the program, you'd probably occasionally run into bugs, and you might have ideas for new features or different features. So you could go to the source code and fix the bugs and add more features. You could make any change you could think of. People would sometimes tell you, please make your own copy and change that. And you could also cut a piece of it out and put it into some other program that you were working on. We called that cannibalizing the old program, which was a joke, because when you cannibalize a machine for spare parts, that machine doesn't work anymore. But when you cannibalize a program, you're copying part of it, so it's not broken, it still runs just the same. So you could use this FooBar program not just by running it, but in all the various ways it might potentially be useful. You could study it, you could change it, you could adapt it, you could learn from it and copy from it. So the software developed in our community was part of human knowledge. The incompatible time-sharing system that we used was part of human knowledge, available to anyone who wanted to learn from it. And because of that, I was able to feel very proud of the work I was doing. I was not merely helping one group of people beat out another group of people. I was working for everyone. I was on everybody's side. And that's something that I can feel very proud of doing. However, eventually we got a taste of what life was like for most computer users, the ones who were not part of a community like ours. This happened when Xerox gave MIT a laser printer. This laser printer was a handsome gift because it was the first time anyone outside Xerox ever had a laser printer. It was the first generation. It was actually a high-speed office copier that had been modified internally to turn it into a printer. In some ways, it was very good. It printed a page a second. It had high resolution. Straight lines came out sharp and straight, but it also got frequent paper jams. As a copier, it would have had somebody standing nearby, so when it got jammed, the person would have fixed it. But as a printer, it was off by itself. Often, nobody went there for an hour, and it could stay jammed for an hour. It was a substantial practical problem. And as soon as we recognized that this was a frequent problem, we had an idea for how to solve it. We thought we could use the same method that we used for the previous printer, the old printer, that was slow and low resolution and tended to make straight lines come out a bit wavy, and also got paper jams. Since we were programmers, not printer designers, we couldn't make that printer any faster or any higher resolution or make it not get paper jams. But we were able to change the software that ran the printer to compensate for the paper jams, at least. You see, I added a feature to the program that controlled the printer so that every time the printer got jammed, the system displayed a message on the screen for those users who were waiting for printing right then, saying, "The printer is jammed, go fix it." Now, if you got that message, you were not going to take the risk of assuming someone else would fix it, because you knew that only a few people were waiting for printing, and only those people were getting the message. So you would go to the printer right away. As a result, although the printer still jammed occasionally, a minute later, 2 or 3 people would come and fix it. In effect, we treated the user as part of the system, and we added end-to-end feedback, and we got reliable operation from the system as a whole, even though the printer itself was still unreliable. Well, that was a good solution, so we thought of using it for the new printer, but there we ran into a stone wall. You see, we were able to use this approach for the old printer because it was controlled by a free program, part of the community's software. We had the source code. We could make changes in it to do anything we wanted, limited only by our skill as programmers. But the new printer was controlled by a proprietary Xerox program. We did not have the source code, and that meant that we were completely helpless. Didn't matter how skilled we were, we couldn't do anything to it. We were prisoners of our software. And the result of that was constant frustration. You would type the command to print a file, and then you'd go back to work, because you know it would be foolish to expect it to be printed soon. A while later, you'd notice the time. Oh, it's been half an hour. Well, I can't be sure it's been printed yet, and I don't desperately need it, so I'll go back to work. A while later, you'd notice the time. Oh, it's been a whole hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it's been jammed the whole time. So you fix it and you go back to work, and you say, and a while later you notice the time. Oh, it's been a half hour. Maybe it's printed now. So you walk upstairs to the printer and you see it printed 200 pages of other people's stuff, 3.5 minutes for this fast printer, and jammed again. And at that point you'd say, I'm going to stand here and fix this damn thing every time it jams until I get my output. Constant frustration. It wasn't supposed to work that way, but that's the way it did work. And what made it even more galling was to realize that we could have solved the problem, except that somebody in Xerox was deliberately standing in our way, deliberately keeping us helpless by giving us only the binary of that program. Eventually, I heard that somebody at Carnegie Mellon University had a copy of that source code. Later on, I was in the area, so I went to his office and said, "Hi, I'm from MIT. Could I have a copy of the printer software source code?" And he said, "No, I promised not to give you a copy." And I was stunned as well as angry. I hadn't expected a response like that. And I couldn't think of a way to express my anger that would do justice to it. All I could think of at that moment was to walk out of his room without saying one more word to him. Maybe because of that, I kept thinking about it for a long time afterwards. You see, his refusal to cooperate with us, his colleagues at MIT, was very bad for the users at the Artificial Intelligence Lab, because we never got a copy of that source code and we were never able to fix the problem, and that printer remained a frustration to use for all the years we kept using it. But indirectly, it was very good for me because it taught me an important lesson. Important because most programmers never learn it. You see, he had promised to refuse to help us, his colleagues at MIT, but he didn't just do that to us. I'm pretty sure he did that to you too. And I expect he did that to you as well. And I think you also, most likely. And probably you too. In fact, he probably promised to refuse to help just about each of you in this room. The exceptions being maybe some who weren't born yet at the time, so you weren't included, because he had promised to deny his cooperation to just about the entire population of planet Earth. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement. This was my first personal encounter with a non-disclosure agreement. I was the victim. I and my whole lab were the victims. And the lesson I learned was that non-disclosure agreements have victims. They're not harmless, they're not innocent. You're actually promising to betray most of humanity. It's like signing a blank check of betrayal. I promise I will not help blank if he or she wants my help. And this blank gets filled in later by circumstances, perhaps with the name of a stranger, perhaps with the name of your brother. You don't know who you're betraying, but you should know that you're betraying a lot of people. Most programmers don't learn this lesson because most programmers and most computer users, in fact, first encounter a non-disclosure agreement when they're invited to sign one. And there's always some kind of temptation that you're going to get if you sign. So they make up excuses to close their eyes to the ethics of what they are doing. They say, he'll never get a copy anyway, so what difference does it make if I join a conspiracy to deprive him? They say, this is the way things are done. Who am I to question it? They say, if I don't do this, somebody else will. Various excuses to gag their consciences. But when somebody asked me to sign a non-disclosure agreement, my conscience was already sensitized, and it would not be gagged. I couldn't forget how angry I was when somebody else had betrayed me and my whole lab and refused to cooperate with us. And I couldn't turn around and do the same thing to somebody else who probably didn't deserve it any more than we did. So I said, thank you for offering me this nice software package, but I cannot accept it in good conscience on the conditions you have set. So I will do without it. No thanks. And I have never knowingly signed a non-disclosure agreement for generally useful technical information such as software. I make that limitation because there are other kinds of information which raise different ethical issues. For instance, there's personal information, a completely different issue. I've been talking about programs that are in some sense being published. Personal information is a totally different question. If you wanted to talk with me about what's going on between you and your sweetheart, and would I please not tell anybody, I could say yes to that, because that's not generally useful technical information. At least it probably isn't. Now, I could imagine that you might disclose to me a wonderful new sex technique, and I might then feel a moral duty to pass this on to the rest of humanity, people who might have a chance to use it. But if it were just a matter of details, personal details, who hurt whose feelings, how, and what that one did in return, and so on, those details of your life are things that other people don't need to know in order to live their lives. So it's okay for me to keep that private for you. But when it comes to the stuff of science and technology, the mission of these fields is to develop useful information for humanity. If we withhold it instead, we're betraying the mission of our fields. And after some years of consideration, I concluded that that was wrong, that nobody should do it, and in particular, I should not do it. But during those same years, a series of blows fell on my community and ended up wiping it out. Perhaps the final blow was when digital discontinued making the PDP-10 computer. You see, the incompatible time-sharing system was started in the 1960s, so of course we wrote it in assembler language, the assembler language for the PDP-10. So when the PDP-10 was discontinued, 15 years of our work turned into dust and blew away. Now, as you can imagine, that's a heavy blow in itself. But the consequences in this case were even worse, because all the operating systems for modern computers that you could get at that time were proprietary. In fact, you had to sign a non-disclosure agreement even to get the executable form. And the result of this was to put me in a moral dilemma, and every other computer user too. You see, I couldn't continue working in my field of operating system development in the way I had been doing it, because that depended on having a community of people to work with and a body of free software to use and improve. Both of them were gone now. The community was dissolved and the software was obsolete. So what was I going to do? The most obvious alternative, the one most people would have suggested to me, was to accept that the world had changed and adapt myself to it, to be Shaw's reasonable man. This would have meant using non-free software, signing non-disclosure agreements, and probably MIT would have had me developing non-free software. I thought about that and realized that that way I could have fun programming and make money. But at the end, I would look back and say, I have spent my career building walls to divide people, and I would be ashamed of everything I had done. So I looked for some other possibility, and it wasn't hard to find one. I could leave the programming field and do something else. Many programmers seem to find that unthinkable. They say, if I don't do this, this, and this to get a programming job, I'll starve. They literally claim that they will starve. Now, even in India, there are millions of people who don't work as programmers and are not starving. So I think that they're exaggerating somewhat. Now, I had no other noteworthy skills, but I'm sure I could have been a waiter. Perhaps not at a fine restaurant, but I could have been a waiter somewhere. Now, there are two things to note about being a waiter. One is, being a waiter is not unethical, unless perhaps if you're at McDonald's. And second, as a waiter, you're not going to starve. Unless perhaps if it's at McDonald's. please be aware that the popularity of McDonald's is due to a confusion on the part of poorly educated Americans. They heard the term fast food and they thought it meant rapid food. They didn't realize it meant food for not eating. But that's exactly what it's meant for. The idea is that if you are fasting, but you're getting hungry and you're feeling a pull to eat something, you imagine that McDonald's food and you lose your appetite. And that way you can complete your fast. So now, if anyone ever suggests to you that you should eat at McDonald's, you understand how to explain why that's a mistake. So, I had found an ethical way to cope with the situation I was in. And that makes a difference because you can justify doing things that are unethical to a certain point if it's the only way you can survive. You know, if it's not as bad as your death, then you can argue it's justified. But I couldn't make that argument because I had found another way I could survive, at least. So I couldn't say it's better for me to develop non-free software than to die. I could live anyway without developing non-free software. But I realized that for me, being a waiter would be no fun at all, and it would be a waste of my skill as an operating system developer. It's better to waste a skill than to misuse it. So this was a step up. Developing non-free software would be misuse of the skill. It would be negative. Wasting the skill is zero. That's a step up, but it's still not good. So for these two reasons, I asked myself, what could an operating system developer do that would be positive, that would make the world a better place? And I realized that operating system development was exactly the skill that was needed to make the world a better place. The moral dilemma existed both for me and for all computer users because all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. By developing another operating system and then telling people this you are free to share, free to use in a community, we could create a way out of the moral dilemma for everyone. And I realized that this was probably the most important task that I would ever have a chance to try to do in my whole life. And I concluded that I had been elected by circumstances to do the job. It's as if you saw somebody drowning and you know how to swim and it's not Bush, then you have a moral duty to save the person. Well, I don't know how to swim, but I do know how to write software, and in this case, writing software was the work that was necessary. I was aware of this problem, and nobody else was paying attention to it. I had the skills necessary to try to solve the problem, and as far as I can see, nobody else would try to solve it if I did not. So I decided that I would develop a free software operating system or die trying, presumably of old age, because at the time, free software had no enemies. There was nobody actively trying to stop us from developing a free operating system. It was just a big job. So big that many people looked at it and said, yes, I wish it were done, but I won't try because it's such a big job. I decided to try anyway because this was the only way to live an upright life and have freedom. That decision led me to a bunch of other decisions, technical design decisions. What kind of system should it be? Well, I had just seen one free operating system turn into dust and blow away because it was written for one particular kind of computer which became obsolete. I didn't want to write another system and have the same thing happen. So I figured this system that I was going to write had better be portable. It better be capable of running on many different kinds of computers, because I didn't know what kind of computer people would be using in 5 years or 10 years. There was just one successful portable operating system at the time, and that was Unix. In addition, Unix had some good ideas by the standards of the day. For instance, it had pipes and redirection of input and output and shell programming that was powerful and convenient, and the fork and exec system calls that were simple enough people really used them. So I decided to follow the design of Unix, figuring that way there was a pretty good chance I could succeed in making a system that would work portably. Further, I realized that users don't like incompatible changes. I could have picked the best ideas I had seen in the various systems I had worked on and added my own favorite ideas and designed my dream operating system. But then it would have been incompatible with everything. And I knew the users would say, "This is very nice, but it's incompatible. We've already taught our users to use Unix. We've written our software for Unix. To switch to your system would just be too much work. So no thank you." At that point, I would have had a ready-made excuse. I could have said, "I offered them freedom, they didn't take it, it's their fault." But I wanted to make more than just an excuse. I wanted to build a community that would actually have people living in it and enjoying the benefits of liberty. To do that, I had to write a system that people would actually use. Being compatible with some popular system would help this very much. So I decided to make the system compatible with Unix. Upward compatible, that is. The features that people were using on Unix would have to work the same way on this system. But we could add new features. We could add anything we wanted to. Any new ideas we had, we could add. But the old things would have to keep working. Now, Unix consists of many components that communicate through interfaces that were more or less documented. To be compatible with Unix, you have to replace each component one by one in a compatible way so that they still use the same interfaces. The users also use those interfaces. And that meant that the initial design decisions were already decided by that one decision to be compatible with Unix. And that was convenient. The only other decision necessary before I could start work was to choose a name. Now, we hackers, because we're working in the spirit of playful cleverness, we like to pick funny or even mischievous and naughty names for our programs. The thought of the users laughing at the name is half the fun of writing the program, and figuring out how to solve the problems is the other half of the fun. And there was a hacker tradition that when you are writing a program that's compatible with some existing program, you can give your new program a name that's a recursive acronym whose meaning is that this program is not the other one. For instance, in 1975, I developed the original Emacs text editor, an extensible programmable text editor. You can reprogram it while you're using it. And people liked this, so they started making imitations of it for different systems. And some of them were called something or other Emacs, but one was called Fine for Fine is not Emacs. And there was Sign for Sign is not Emacs. And Ina for Ina is not Emacs. And Mince for Mince is not complete Emacs. Then Ina was mostly rewritten, and version 2 was called Zwei, for Zwei was Ina initially. So you can see you can have a lot of fun with recursive acronyms. Programmers in general tend to find recursive humor funny. So I looked for a recursive acronym for something is not Unix. But the problem is that I couldn't find any English words ending in INU. And if it doesn't have some other meaning, it's not funny. So I had to look for some other way to do it. The first thing I thought of, because my brain wasn't at its most creative right then, was make a contraction then I could try a 3-letter recursive acronym. So I started trying letters: Anu, Bnu, Knu, Dnu, Inu, Fnu, Gnu. Well, GNU is the funniest word in the English language. It's used for more wordplay than anything else. There's even a funny song inspired by the word GNU. The reason why this word is used for so much wordplay is, according to the dictionary, it's pronounced new. So people started asking each other as a joke, "Hey, what's GNU?" instead of "Hey, what's new?" That was probably before I was born. In any case, it was long before the GNU operating system. So that's the explanation for the humor. But when it's the name of our operating system, please disregard the dictionary. Please pronounce a hard G. Say GNU. If you talk about the new operating system, you'll get people confused because we've been working on it for 20 years now, so it's not new anymore. But it still is and always will be GNU, no matter how many people call it Linux by mistake. So I had a name, I could start work, but there was something I had to do first. On January 5th, 1984, I quit my job at MIT to start developing pieces of the GNU system. I had to quit my job because had I remained an MIT employee, MIT could have claimed to own the software I was writing and could have turned it into proprietary software products. And since MIT had done that kind of thing already, I could hardly assume it would not happen again. I didn't want to have to get MIT's approval for all the details of how to release this software. So I took MIT out of the equation by quitting my job. Although I had quit my job, the head of the AI lab was nice enough to let me keep using the facilities. I walked in and he said, "You still want to quit?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Do you want to keep your key?" I hadn't thought about the possibility, so I thought for a minute and said, "Okay." So I began using a Unix machine at the AI lab to start developing pieces of the GNU system, because you have to write these pieces one by one. That was the first time I ever really used Unix. I was not a Unix wizard, I was not a Unix fan the way some other people were at the time. I made the decision to follow the design of Unix for exactly the reasoning that I've told you. And at this point, I actually got to see what using Unix was like. And I saw some flaws, but I concluded that they were not disastrous, that it was still a good decision to follow the design of Unix. Now, at the time, I thought that I and the other people helping, because I had made an announcement on the internet asking people to join in, that we would write all these pieces, and when we had an entire system running, then we would invite people to use it. But that's not what happened, because in September 1984, I started developing GNU Emacs, which was my second implementation of the extensible text editor. And by early '85, it was working well enough that I could use it for all my editing. That was a big relief, because I had absolutely no intention of learning to use VI. So until that point, I did my editing on some other computer where there was an Emacs, and then copied the files through the net to the Unix machine to test them. But once GNU Emacs was running, I could do my editing on the Unix machine, which was more convenient. But since GNU Emacs was good enough for my editing, it was good enough for a bunch of other people too. People started asking me for copies of GNU Emacs so that they could run it on their Unix machines. You see, there was no GNU system yet. There were just a few pieces. So they couldn't possibly run the GNU system, but they could take this piece of it and run it on another system. And they wanted to do that, which meant that I had to address the specific detailed questions of how to distribute these pieces of the GNU system, which we also call GNU packages. Of course, I put a copy in the FTP server directory, and that way people on the internet could get copies. But in 1985, even in the US, most programmers were not on the internet. And some of them were asking me for copies anyway. So the question was, how would I respond? They asked me to send them copies on magnetic tapes. And it takes work to write these tapes. So I could have said to them, I want to spend my time writing more pieces of the GNU system, not writing tapes to mail to people, so please find a friend who is connected to the net who can download it and put it on tape for you. But I had no job, and in fact, I've never had a job since 20 years ago, and I was looking for some way to make money through my work on free software. So I said, send me $150 and I'll mail you a tape with GNU Emacs on it. And of course, $150 is a lot more than it would actually cost to buy the tape and write it and mail it. So I would have made a considerable amount of money out of that amount. And the orders began dribbling in. By the middle of the year, they were trickling in, and I was getting 8 to 10 orders a month, which, if necessary, I could have lived on. So I had an adequate free software business going, just about a year and a half after I started this. It's easier to make a living from free software if you don't demand to live in a very luxurious fashion. Now, most Americans, if they start making this much money, they look for a way to spend this much money. I don't understand them. Maybe people here are a bit smarter than that. But you know, they start buying houses and cars and boats and airplanes and artwork and rare stamps and adventure travel and children, all sorts of expensive luxuries. And once they buy these things, they have to spend more money to keep, for a lot of them, to keep them up. And the result is that they have to spend all of their time desperately trying to get as much money as they can, and they have no time to enjoy any of these things, which is especially sad when it's a matter of children. And, you know, the other things can get repossessed, but they can't ungive birth to the children. And so it leads to a lot of misery, actually. But if you can resist the feeling that you need such expensive lifestyles, then you can avoid being a puppet of money, and you can decide what you're going to do with your life and do something that matters to you. The less money you need, the easier it is to get, and the smaller a part of your life that has to be. And the rest of your life can then be available for something that matters. So I'm very glad that I've always tried to avoid expensive habits. But people used to ask me, what do you mean it's free software if it costs $150? Isn't that a contradiction? Well, it sounds like one because the word free in English has multiple meanings. One meaning is zero price, and another meaning refers to freedom. When we speak of free software, we're talking about freedom, not price. So think of free speech, not free beer. Some of the users got their copies of GNU Emacs from me through the net, and they did not pay me anything. Some got their copies from me on a tape, and they paid me. Others got their copies not from me, but from somebody else who already had a copy. Maybe they paid that somebody else, but they didn't pay me. I don't know if they paid the somebody else because that matter was between them. Nobody had to tell me anything about it. So GNU Emacs was gratis for some users and paid for some users. But it was free software for all the users because all of them had the crucial freedoms that every computer user should have. So at this point, I should tell you the rough definition of free software. Free software is defined in terms of freedom for the user. A program is free software for you if you have 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program for any purpose in any manner. Freedom 1 is the freedom to help yourself by studying the source code to see how it works and what it does, and then changing it to do what you want. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor by distributing copies to others. And freedom 3 is the freedom to help build your community by publishing an improved version or a modified version so that others can get the benefit of your contribution. I made that correction, a modified version, because people can disagree about what's better. Your modified version may be better for you and better for some people, while others might prefer the original. So they have a choice. All 4 of these freedoms are essential. Sometimes people call them levels of freedom, but that's a mistake. It implies that, you know, the more levels you've got, the better it is. But actually, they're all necessary. If any of them is missing, if any of them is denied to you, then the program is not free software and shouldn't be used. But why these particular freedoms? How did I reach this conclusion that this was the right definition to use? How do you decide where to draw the line? These are the freedoms that are necessary for computer users to form a community where they can freely cooperate with each other when they choose and be in control of their own computer use. For those goals, these are the freedoms you must have. Freedom 0 is pretty obvious. In fact, most software gives you freedom 0. There are programs that are particularly nasty and restrictive and don't give you freedom 0. But those are pretty much an exception even today. So what distinguishes free software from typical software is freedoms 1, 2, and 3. Freedom 2 is the freedom that permits you to live an upright life. It's necessary for basic moral reasons. If you don't have freedom 2, then as soon as your friend comes by and says, "That's nice, could I have a copy?" you are in a moral dilemma. You have to choose between 2 evils. One evil is break the agreement you made and help your friend, and the other evil is comply with the agreement you made but be a bad neighbor. So you'd have to choose the lesser of these 2 evils. And the lesser of the 2 evils is to violate the agreement and help your friend, because your friend presumably deserves to be treated well, whereas whoever imposed an agreement like this on you, trying to divide you from your friend, does not deserve what he wants. So that's the lesser evil, but it's still an evil. And if you recognize this, if you recognize that starting to use this program, which doesn't give you freedom number 2, will lead you eventually to a choice between 2 evils, you really should refuse to go down that path at all. You should say, "No, I don't want to use this program." Because if you insist on having free software, then when your friend comes and says, "Could I have a copy?" you don't have to choose between 2 evils. You can openly make a copy for your friend, and you're not violating any agreement you made because you refused to make such an evil agreement. If you don't have freedom 2, then the program pollutes society's most important resource, which is the spirit of goodwill, the willingness and the habit of helping other people. Of course, we don't expect anybody to spend 100% of the time helping other people, because you have to take care of your own needs as well. I wouldn't ask anybody to ignore completely his own needs and pay attention only to other people. So If you are female and you have been taught to do that, I hope that you can unlearn it. But everyone should be paying a certain amount of attention to helping other people. And we, in society, this particular aspect of human nature is present in various people to varying amounts, but society, by what it teaches people, can increase it or reduce it. If we tell people that life is nothing but selfishness and everybody is always selfish, and you're a fool if you're not selfish, then the amount of willingness to help others will go down. This will happen less often. It will be a smaller part of society. And that means that this resource, the level of this resource, the spirit of goodwill, becomes less. But if we teach people the habit, especially starting when they're children, of helping other people when they can, then the level of goodwill in society goes up. And even if it only goes up a little bit, it still makes society a much better place to live. It's no coincidence that the world's major religions, at least most of them, have been encouraging this spirit of goodwill towards other people for thousands of years, because that makes for a better society for everyone, even if you only influence people to do it a little more. So, what does it mean when powerful social institutions start telling people that you're not supposed to share, that it's wrong to share? They are poisoning this vital resource, something that society cannot afford. And what does it mean when they say, if you give a friend a copy of a program, you're a pirate? They're saying that helping your neighbor is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. That's what pirates do. They attack ships. That is morality backwards, because attacking a ship is very, very bad. But sharing with other people is good. And what does it mean when they start making harsh punishments for people who share with their neighbor? How much fear do you think it's going to take before everyone is so scared that they never help each other anymore? And do you want that level of fear to be introduced into your society? In Argentina and in Germany, they have even taken this to the point, which I can only call a terror campaign. They have threatened people with being raped in prison if they use unauthorized copies of software, which shows just how far they're willing to go in barbarity to get their way, to impose their power on the rest of society. I think we should reject their terror campaign and put an end to it. And that's the basic idea of the free software movement. That's the explanation for freedom number 2, the freedom to help your neighbor by distributing copies to others. Freedom 1, the freedom to help yourself by studying the source code and changing it to do what you want. That's necessary for a different reason. That's so that you can have freedom individually in running the program on your computer. You see, if you have this freedom, then you control what the program does. If you don't have this freedom, then you don't control it. The developer controls it, and the developer thus has power over you when you are using that program. The developer controls what happens when you run that program. You don't. So in order for you to have this basic freedom to control your own computer, you must have freedom 1. There are quite a number of non-free programs that contain malicious features. Features deliberately introduced not to make the program serve you, but rather to spy on you, restrict you, control you, or interfere with you. For instance, a program as common as Windows XP spies on the user. It's not the first version of Microsoft Windows to do that. Several years ago, Microsoft set up Windows so that it would mail to Microsoft a list of what's installed on your disk. There was an outcry about this, and they took the feature out. And then a few years later, they snuck it back in. And to make it hard to spot, they had it send the information encrypted so that you couldn't tell what was going on just by looking at the network traffic. So people had to do some work rather cleverly to figure out that Windows XP, whenever it asks for an upgrade, reports first exactly what's installed on your disk. But Windows is not the only program that spies on you, because Windows Media Player also does. Every time you look at something with Windows Media Player, it reports who you are and what you're looking at, spying on you all the time. But lest you think that this practice is limited only to Microsoft, Real Player also spies on you the same way, and the TiVo spies on you the same way. People were excited a few years ago because the TiVo uses a lot of free software, but it also has non-free software in it, and it spies on you. Spying is not the worst that it gets. There are many programs which are designed to stop you from doing some of the things that they're designed to do. These features are often referred to as DRM, Digital Restrictions Management. You know, that the program is designed for accessing certain kinds of documents or files, but refuses to let you do it. It may be a DVD player and says, sorry pal, you live in the wrong part of the world, I won't let you play this DVD. That's one example, but the restrictions can become very complicated and atrocious. It's not limited to that. Some non-free programs change your computer setup so that it will display ads for you all the time from then on. And they don't tell you this. They figure you won't know where it came from. And some of them get even more bizarre. For instance, the Kazaa music sharing software is designed so that they can sell time on your computer as part of a distributed computing scheme. And they never told the users that the program would do this, but when it was found out, they pointed at their end user license, which basically said they could do almost anything in the world, and said, you see, the users already said yes to this. Not specifically, though. That's the way they act. They put in malicious features and then they say, read the fine print. You said we could put in any kind of malicious feature we want. When Windows XP asks for an upgrade, the upgrade server could theoretically give you a different upgrade from what it gives to everybody else. So even if Windows doesn't contain a backdoor in the strict sense of the term, the upgrade server could be used to introduce one into your machine at any time, or introduce anything at all into your machine. When you use non-free software, specifically when you don't have Freedom 1, you are forced to put blind faith in the developer of the program, and as you see, some of them clearly don't deserve it. Now, I won't say that all developers of non-free software introduce malicious features deliberately. Some don't. But they're all human, so they all make mistakes. We free software developers make mistakes too. But the difference is, when you don't have Freedom 1, you can't fix their mistakes. You are the helpless prisoner of their decisions and all their detailed choices, whether it's a mistaken choice of features or just a foolish, silly error that we all make. You're stuck with it. You're helpless. You're a prisoner of your software. But when you do have Freedom 1, you can correct any mistake that I make. You're in control of the program when it's running on your machine, and you can make it do what you want. But Freedom 1 is not enough. Freedom 1 is the freedom to personally take control of what the software is doing on your computer. But it's not enough because, first of all, there are millions of users who don't know how to program, and they can't personally take advantage of Freedom 1. But even for us programmers, freedom 1 is not enough because there's too much software. Nobody has time to study all of these programs and master them all so as to be able to make the changes he or she wants in all these programs. So we need more. We need freedom 3. Freedom 3 enables us to work together to make the software do what we want. It allows any collectivity of users to take control and makes the program do what they want. Suppose there are 1 million users who want a certain program to be different in a certain way. Maybe 10,000 of these people know how to program. Just you'd expect, on the average, you know, out of 1 million people who use computers, 10,000 will know how to program. And maybe 10 of them will decide to implement the change the program, and then with Freedom 3 they can publish their modified version. And now all 1 million users can use the modified version. So if a few people who share this desire for a change do the work, everyone else can take advantage of it. Once they publish their modified version, now every user can choose between the original version and the modified version. And if there are 1 million people who want the change, the modified version will now become popular. And then further changes will be made by various people starting from there. And this sets up a situation somewhat like biological evolution. If there are a lot of people wanting the program to develop in this direction, a lot of changes in this direction will be made, and the program will make progress in the direction that a lot of people want. And if there are a few people who want the program to change in this direction, occasionally a change will be made going in this direction, so it will make slow progress in this direction. And if nobody wants to go in that direction, nobody will make those changes and it won't go in that direction. So the users, by the sum total of their individual decisions, determine which way the program will be changed, and sometimes they can decide to make 2 different versions go in 2 different directions. If they're different people wanting different things, they can all have what they want as long as somebody does some work. Even if you personally don't know how to program, you can still directly influence the way the program is developed by paying somebody else to make changes. And of course, it's not all that common that individuals do this, but it's quite common for organizations and businesses and governments to do this. A user of the software, an organizational user, decides, we want the program to be different this way. So they go to a company of programmers and say, how much will you charge to make this change for us, and when can you have it done? And if they don't like that answer, they can go to another company and say, what will you charge? When can you have it done? Which shows that free software brings with it a free market for all kinds of support and services. That's in contrast to proprietary software. With proprietary, non-free software, support is a monopoly because only the developer that owns the program has the source code, so only that developer can possibly make any change in the program. If you want to change, you have to beg. But with free software, you can just go out and pay somebody to do it. Because there's a free market for support, those users that consider support very important can expect to get better support for their money in general if they're using free software. There may be a choice of non-free programs to do a certain job, but in a paradoxical way, once you choose one of them, support is still going to be a monopoly. So you have a choice between different monopolies. That may sound strange, but if you look at it clearly, that's exactly what it is. In effect, this means you have a way of choosing who's going to be your master. But choosing your master is not freedom. So a choice of non-free programs is not good enough. We have to insist on having a free program to do the job so that we can do it in freedom. So these are the reasons why these 4 freedoms are essential. These freedoms make it possible for the users to control their own computing and give users the freedom to treat each other decently, to be good to each other. And therefore I say that we should all insist that software we use be free for us, that we always have these freedoms. We should say no to non-free software and work actively to replace it with free software. Work actively to liberate cyberspace and liberate all the citizens of cyberspace. Now, you'll notice I defined the concept of free software in a slightly complicated way. I said a program is free software for you, a particular user, if you have these freedoms. Why did I put that complication in? The reason is that the same code can be free software for some users and non-free for other users. This might seem strange, so let me give an example to illustrate how it happens. The biggest example I know of this phenomenon is the X window system, which was developed at MIT in the 1980s and released by MIT under a license that gives the user all four of these freedoms. So as released by MIT, it was free software. So if you got that version, it was free software for you. But among those who got that version were various computer manufacturers that distributed Unix systems. They took the source code of X, they made the changes necessary so it would run on their platform, and then they compiled it to make binaries. And they put those binaries into their Unix system and distributed only the binaries under the same non-disclosure agreement as all the rest of the binaries in their Unix system. Millions of users got copies of the X window system in this way, and for them it was just as non-free as Unix. They had none of these four freedoms. This created a paradoxical situation. If you ask the question, is the X window system free software or not, the answer depended on where you made the measurement. If you made the measurement coming out of the developers group, you'd say, here I observe all the freedoms, it's free software here. But if you made the measurement among the users, you'd say, most of them don't have these freedoms, it's not free software there. The developers of X did not consider this a problem. They were not aiming to give the users freedom. They were aiming for a big professional success. As far as they were concerned, those millions of users who had their code but not freedom were part of their success. But in the GNU project, our goal was specifically to win freedom for computer users. If the same thing that happened to X and had happened to other programs earlier were to happen to the GNU system, then we would be a failure. So I looked for some way to stop that from happening, something I could do in advance to prevent it. And I developed a method that we call copyleft. You can think of it as taking copyright and flipping it over. The reason for this is that it uses copyright law, but uses it to achieve the exact opposite of the usual purpose for which copyright law is used. Copyright law is typically used for a right-wing purpose, namely to keep people in subjugation and make them pay a lot of money. Copyleft uses the same law for a left-wing goal, that is, to facilitate cooperation and equality and to protect the rights of all the users. Here's how it works. We start with a copyright notice that informs the users that this program is copyrighted, which by default means it's forbidden to copy or distribute or modify this program. But then we say, you're authorized to copy it, to make copies. You're authorized to distribute the copies. You're authorized to modify it. You're authorized to publish modified or extended versions. Now it looks like we've just gotten rid of everything we did by saying it's copyrighted. But you see, we attach a condition. And the condition is the reason to go through all this trouble. so that we can impose this condition. And the condition says, whenever you redistribute this program or any modified or extended version, that entire thing you distribute must be distributed under the same conditions, no more and no less. Meaning, you're not allowed to add any restrictions. You're not allowed to receive our code with the freedom, strip off the freedom, and pass along just the code. Whoever gets it from you must get from you the same freedom that you got from us. So the code and the freedom become legally inseparable. Wherever the code goes, the freedom goes. Every user who gets the code has freedom. That's the idea of copyleft. Now, copyleft itself is a general idea. To use it, you need an implementation. You need a specific license written down, particular words. The copyleft license used by 2/3 of all free software packages is called the GNU General Public License, or GNU GPL for short. Once you've made it clear which GPL you're talking about, you might just say GPL. But the first time you should say which one you mean, because there are other GPLs. For instance, there is the Simputer GPL, the Simputer General Public License, a totally different license with essentially no resemblance to ours. So please do say which one you mean, but then you can shorten it to just GPL. Of course, this is one way to implement copyleft. You could write your own copyleft license, and occasionally people do, but there's a big advantage in using the same one, which is that two programs both released under the GNU General Public License can be combined. That you can copy code from one into the other. You can take a piece of this one and a piece of that one and put them together and add more. So it's very useful to use the same free software license for many programs. And the GNU GPL is used, I think, for over 2/3 of all free software packages. But that still leaves plenty of free software packages that use different licenses, some of which are non-copyleft licenses. For instance, the license of the X Window system is an example of a non-copyleft free software license. The developers of non-copylefted free software are doing something good. They're contributing to our community because they respect your freedom. They don't take away your freedom. However, they could do it better. They could go beyond just respecting your freedom and actively protect your freedom. That's the idea of copyleft. So we disagree with them. We say that they're not doing the best possible thing. But still, what they're doing is good. They're not wrong. We just disagree with some of their particular choices. The software they develop is free. It can be included in the GNU system or any other free operating system, and we use it. For instance, we use the X Window system. I wanted to have graphical windowing facilities in GNU from the very beginning. Unix at the time did not have any kind of graphical facilities, graphical interfaces, but I thought we needed some. However, we never developed a window system for GNU because before we got around to doing that, while we were working on other parts of the system first, we saw X. The X Window system was not copylefted, but it was free software, which is the crucial thing. And it was becoming popular, it was powerful, it became a de facto standard. So I made the decision in the late 80s, we will not write our own Windows system, we will use X. So we put X into the GNU system and we started making other pieces of GNU work with X. Time to change? During the 80s, our TAD